Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Controlled Randomization webinar by DFnet Research. My name is Tadas, and I am the Systems Analyst Programmer at DFnet. Everyone currently is muted. I would request that you all please remain muted, and if you have any questions, feel free to type them in the chat, and we will be having a Q&A session at the end where I can answer any questions that you may have. So today we will be covering controlled randomization, the general overview of the concept, and how to implement it into your DFdiscover studies. So what we're going to be covering today is understanding controlled randomization. What is it and how does it work? The user's perspective, so from DFexplore, and providing a live demo of its utility. I'll be covering the system components, so from DF setup and DF admin, and how we can implement it into the study from a general perspective. And then we'll cover any miscellaneous information in regards to documentation, where you can find additional resources, and what you can do to learn more about this system. All right, so let's begin with understanding controlled randomization. What is it? And I'd like to put a quick little disclaimer here that I am in no means an expert in the field of conducting controlled randomization studies. I am more of a programmer who builds the infrastructure on the back end. So this information may vary from study to study. I just wanted to bring a broad oversight for any people who might not know what a controlled randomization study is. So what is controlled randomization? The term controlled randomization is a mechanism that assigns each subject to a treatment option randomly. The participants can't choose which treatment they get, and the doctors can't choose which treatment they are assigned. So subjects, doctors, and database users remain blinded. They do not know which participant or which subject is utilizing or using which treatment. And it allows for a controlled balance of subjects in each treatment. So we are going to be covering Permuted-block Randomization, which I will be going into further depth in a moment, but it allows you to maintain a healthy balance of how many participants or subjects land in each treatment group. So why use controlled randomization? The primary reason is because it reduces treatment bias. If the subject doesn't know what they're getting, they might not have a bias towards their reaction. So if you are told that you're getting a placebo drug, you might react differently than if you're told you're getting this unknown treatment. And doctors also will have to treat every patient identically because they don't know what the participant is getting, and they need to ensure that there is no bias in the treatment care. It also reduces selection bias. So it doesn't look for who's best fit per treatment, and rather instead gives a healthy balance of spreading everyone evenly across all possible treatment options. So the randomization process initiates with a subject who enrolls in a study and is deemed eligible for randomization. The randomization unit then generates a randomization value, which is going to now be associated with that subject, very similar to the way a subject ID is assigned to a subject. This will be the value that is associated with the treatment that the subject gets. Then that randomization value is provided to the unblinded pharmacist, who is the only one who knows which treatment is tied to which randomization value. And then finally, the unblinded pharmacist provides the appropriate treatment to that participant based off of the randomization value provided. So these values are going to be either numerical or alphanumerical. It boils down to your study, how you want to organize it. But these values will mean nothing to the participant other than being the key necessary to be able to get the treatment that is appropriate for that subject. So the random in controlled randomization is the order in which subjects will be randomized. We don't know in which order who will go into the facility and get randomized and be deemed eligible. We don't know what randomization value will be assigned to which subjects. that is also random, and which treatment option is associated with each randomization value. This component is known by the unblinded pharmacist, or if in your study you have other unblinded individuals, they would also be aware of this information. The controlled aspect in controlled randomization is the sequence of randomization values. And when you're looking in through a database, we know which order these will be given out, so we know that the 5th person will be given a specific value. We know the 6th person will be given another predefined specific value. This ensures that no two people get randomized to the same value. It's not purely random, and we know and can track in which order they get handed out, and the pharmacist can ensure that everything is still going in the order that is expected. The other component of control is the randomization values as well. They are predefined. They are generated before the randomization initiates, so you will need to find someone who has a good understanding in statistics and be able to generate you a list of values that do not overlap each other. And these get then predefined and plugged into the system on the back end. These values to the user, to the database user, to people who have access to the setup is meaningless, but these values are very essential to the pharmacist. And then the final controlled part is the size of each treatment group. So you know exactly how many people will land into each group, and that is going to be what we're going to cover next. So a randomization list to a blinded individual, so to the people who are setting up everything in DF setup, they will see this information in a lookup table. It is the sequence ID and then a randomization value. The sequence ID just tracks the first person is going to get randomized to 375. The second person is going to be randomized to 812. These numbers mean nothing to the general individual other than acting like a pin that will unlock them their appropriate treatment. And so when that information is brought over to the pharmacist, they actually have a third column of information, which is the drug that is associated with that randomization value. This way you can ensure that each participant and subject is getting the appropriate drug based off of their randomization value. The method that we use is Permuted-block Randomization. This means that when we generate these randomization lists, we actually do it in chunks of, or blocks of randomization. So, for example, over here, this is blocks of 5 subjects, and within each block of 5 subjects, there's 2 of them get drug A, 2 of them get drug B, and the 5th person gets a placebo. This way, you know that no matter how many participants you enroll into the study, whether it's 5, 10, 15, or 20, you're always going to have an even distribution of 40% people get drug A, 40% people get drug B, and 20% people get the placebo. But no one will know which one they are getting, but we can ensure that there's a even amount of each treatment option. The treatment column, of course, is also just visible to the unblinded pharmacist. So we are now going to look into DFexplore, the user's perspective, what it will look like to be a user and randomize. So I am now going to hop into DFexplore. I'm using 5.1, DFdiscover 5.1. And this is the most recommended version of the software, but we will cover what is possible. In this demonstration study, let's pretend that I have completed my demographics form, I have completed my inclusion-exclusion form, and opening this up, and I go to my randomization form. So this is what the randomization form will look like. And let's pretend that I'm a user at the site ready to randomize a subject. I would provide their visit date. I would confirm that they are eligible for randomization, so responding that they have met all the inclusion and exclusion criteria appropriately. And then when I go to the randomization number field, it will let me know that randomization should only occur once the subject has been deemed eligible for enrollment. I'm allowed to choose whether they want to confirm the randomization effect, and if I say yes, it'll say, please mark this form as final to randomize the subject. So that is an important note here, that the randomization doesn't occur until you save the plate. So until everything is confirmed, and until you can press this final button and save the record as a clean record, it will not randomize the subject. Once I press final, it will say the subject has been randomized to, and it provides me a value from that table. Please print a copy of this form and put it in the subject binder. If I now look back at the randomization form, you will notice that the randomization number is in there and I cannot alter it. If I try and type, it will not work, and the username is hard-coded, so it plugged in who did the randomization date, and the randomization time. This allows you to have full control over everything else in the form, but the randomization stuff is hard-coded to ensure it is secure information. So that's what it looks like on the user side. They just go in, confirm they're eligible, and save the record. The randomization proceeds, and the next time a randomization occurs, it will bring the new subject to a new number. The flow, from a user's perspective, is completing the inclusion and exclusion forms, and we can always customize this for each randomization to be looking at different criteria to be eligible. In this study, it was put together to just say that an inclusion form has been completed. You can improve the edit check to particularly look that certain specific fields say yes, or the form is saved a specific way. So once the person then completes the randomization CRF, it checks whether the subject is eligible via an edit check. If they're not, it prevents the user from proceeding. If they are eligible, it checks that the user wants to confirm and proceed with the randomization. If they say yes again, they will then be prompted to save the record, and upon saving, the subject will be randomized. So now we can take a look at what goes on in DF setup, the system components that make it all flow together. There are two plates that come into play here, the randomization plate, which is what I just showed. This is where the subject's randomization information exists and where the randomization occurs. The next plate that is utilized is the admin sequencer plate. So this is the plate that tracks the randomization sequencing. It sees how many people have been randomized in each group and ensures that the system works effectively and quickly. The name of the plate can be renamed if you want. This is just what we have been using at DFnet. Then alongside those plates, there are edit checks, which help ensure eligibility, security, and do the actual randomization. There are lookup tables, which hold the randomization list. So this system can track multiple randomizations. So if you have a specific set of treatments that are associated with an age group from 18 to 35, and then a different randomization list for people from 36 to 60, you can set up multiple lists on this system. And then the final component is user permissions. You need to ensure that you can provide people access to these plates without giving them too much permission. So prevent people from editing things like the randomization number after it has been populated, or ensuring that if people find the admin sequencer plate, for them not to be able to alter the sequence numbers. And that we will be going into in the follow-up in-depth training of how to achieve that. So the first randomization plate is the one that I just showed and presented. It can be customized as well to fit your study protocol. The important part is that there's some form of eligibility for randomization, but there's a randomization number and then information about the randomization that gets populated by the edit check. The next component is the admin sequencer. So this is a form, in our case, we use an eCRF that has just a few values that points to which sequence of each lookup table we are looking at. So in this case, for this study, we have it set up that there's 4 randomization lists, and there's a different one for each site. So site 250 has had now 12 people randomized in there, and then site 350 has only had 4, and so on and so on. So this helps track, so we know that the very next time when a randomization has to occur, it can find exactly how many people have been randomized and find the appropriate sequence inside the randomization list. So the mechanism map and how it works is that initially a user will complete the randomization plate and they will mark it as final. It is important to note that the user who is randomizing actually has data modify permissions to the randomization plate in DFadmin. This will ensure that they can finish the randomization edit checks requirements of jumping over to a different plate and tracking the sequence ID. So upon saving the randomization record, the edit check executes, which will first check whether the user is deemed eligible for randomization. If the subject is ineligible, the randomization will not proceed and return the user to the randomization form until the user is deemed eligible. Then, if the subject is eligible, the edit check will proceed to the admin sequencer plate, which holds the sequence numbers for all the randomization lists, which I just previously showed, and you need to ensure that your user permissions allow people to data modify that admin sequencer plate as well. The next component is that the admin sequencer value that was associated with this user gets looked up in the lookup table. So in here, where the randomization values exist, that sequence ID will be brought over, and the appropriate randomization value will be extracted and brought back to the edit check. With that information at hand, the final step is to bring that information to both plates. The randomization plate gets the randomization value that was extracted from the lookup table, and the admin sequencer plate is updated to point to the next sequence value in preparations for the next randomization that will occur. In the end, this is the flow of the entire mechanism. I have now the privilege of showcasing the customization. So you can customize where the randomization plate lives. I'm going to quickly hop out and look at DFexplore. So over here, if I'm inside my study, I have a whole site dedicated to administrative information. So when I open up the administrative site and administrative participant ID and open up this admin sequencer plate, I can see my information of how many people have been randomized to each site. And this plate can exist anywhere in the database, but I do highly recommend that you put it somewhere where most users will not be able to just get to, because it will confuse people as to why this plate exists. So I separated it in its own site, its own subject ID, and I have edit checks that if you're not an administrator, that this plate hides itself from plain sight. That way people don't poke around where the values aren't important to them. This can be altered and you can decide where it is as long as you are aware of where it is and you can point the edit check to it. Sorry, that was for the admin sequencer plate. The randomization plate also can be tailored to what is appropriate for your study. The lookup table contents, so what values are inside of the randomization value tables, is up to you to create. So you can contact any type of statistical programmer or someone who can look at the protocol and puzzle out how many people should be randomized to which treatments in how many blocks and create the table. That will be custom fit to your own study. The eligibility conditions, so in our case, it was just checking that they have given a eligibility and ineligibility form. That was our condition, you can customize that to fit for your study, and utility of different randomization lists for different conditions. So you can make your lookup tables point to different tables depending on what kind of conditions are met. So just like the previous example with age, you can also do by site, so you can track multiple lists. And then the last component is emailing. You can customize who gets live database emails. So when the database is live and someone gets randomized, you can have an automatically generated email get sent to someone so they are aware and they don't have to be staring at the database the entire time to be aware of this information. Testing customization, so who gets emails during the process of testing, because you don't want to be sending a mass of emails to the unblinded pharmacist while you're just testing the system. And debugging error customization, so who gets emailed if something was not appropriately set up, if someone's permissions didn't allow them to see the admin sequencer plate, who gets the email to be notified about these issues. Things to consider during implementation is that this edit check has to execute on plate exit. The way DFtrigger, the core component of this randomization, works is that it executes on plate exit, so then it can update a separate record. And then saving the CRF as final is important. If you do not save it as final, then the randomization is not going to proceed. You can alter that in the code, but we do not recommend that. It automatically fills in the username, not the name of the user. So if your name is S_Abraham, then that's what's going to be filled in, regardless of whether your name is something completely different. So when I randomized, it filled in my username, which was just Tadas. This can be altered and solved if you want to tackle it, but you could create a script that extracts information from the user database and then using DFexecute, but that is not implemented in the version that we are utilizing. And then it also automatically fills in the date and time based off of device time. So if you have randomization occurring on multiple sites that are at different time zones, even if everyone presses the randomize button at the exact same time, it's going to give different times because it's based off of the user's device. This can be changed to use server time instead if you would want to, by adding a few extra lines of code. And if you do want that implemented, you can always contact me and I can help provide that. But using the DFcreate date, you can use that in the system. Recommendations and requirements. So it is highly recommended that you use the DFdiscover 5.1 software. Upgrades are free. This will allow you to use the latest version of the software, the latest components, and it works the fastest compared to other ones. So if you have poor internet connections or latency, then upgrading might be beneficial. And it is also recommended that you allocate an administrative level for the admin sequencer plate. So in the case of the studies that we're hosting here at DFnet Research, we have level 6 inside of the database allocated specifically for this. This way, then, no one can accidentally, using batch validation or by any other means, accidentally move the record, because level 6 is specifically cut off just for administrative purposes, and the plate is located in a very particular place that no one other than Site 999 will encounter. By putting in a secure location, it can't get accidentally bumped out. The minimum requirements for the system that DFnet has created is DFdiscover 5.0. Although randomization is potentially possible in previous versions of DataFacts, it is not supported by us, and the system here that I'm presenting is not tailored to that capabilities. It might be possible, but we would recommend that you go with DFdiscover so we can utilize the best features and use the system. And then the minimum requirements is just some sort of secure location for the admin sequencer plate. So it doesn't have to be its own level. It doesn't have to be a specific visit. That can be decided by you of where it's located, but you do need a place where it won't accidentally get pushed. So you don't have a situation where someone validates it to a different level and suddenly no one can randomize because their permissions cannot see a certain hidden level. So a few quick statistics to wrap up. The first utilization of DFnet's controlled randomization began in October of 2018. We have since then randomized over 100 subjects, and it's been very wonderful, and the system has been flowing nicely and has had a few revisions to allow for more flexibility, more security, and we have three different studies that are utilizing this randomization unit internally, and we're excited to start bringing it external and have others start utilizing our code. So if you want more information about this, there will be in 2 weeks on April 4th, there will be another presentation with an in-depth training, and we'll be sending out the invitation to register for that in a few hours. We are preparing all the final details, and you will be able to see that soon. And medusa.dfnetresearch.com is going to be our new location for all the trainings that I'm hosting, and potentially others will as well. Over there right now, we have this randomization training, and I will be doing edit check training. So people should have received invitations to the edit check trainings recently. So there's online trainings, recordings of these webinars. So if you missed it, or you have another individual at your organization who was unable to attend and they want to see it, or if you just want to look back on it, these will be posted up there. Documentation for our systems. The documentation for this randomization unit is going to be up on Medusa, and the direct code. So if you want to just grab the code and start toying with it, and you have registered for the in-depth training, you will have access to the code. And so if you have any questions about Medusa, please contact IT support at dfnetresearch.com, and they will be able to help set you up. So if you need an account and you cannot access a certain component that you believe that your organization has paid for, then contact IT support and we can get you all set up and running. All right, now we're going to tackle questions. All right, so I have a few questions here. I have a question for, will it accommodate stratified randomization? That is a good question. I'd have to look up exactly what stratified randomization encompasses, and I can reply to that in a personal email after reviewing that information. Does the randomization work with DFcollect, or does that feature get added in the future? So the randomization unit almost completely works in DFcollect. There are still a few minor things that need to be established, but not inside of the code of the randomization unit. It appears that DFcollect still needs minor update to the way DFtrigger works for it to be fully functional. We are in the process of it, but at this given moment, it is not compatible. It will be in the near future. So how does a site handle the situation where DFdiscover is unavailable, but the randomization needs to occur? If I go back to the study that I have set up here, and I will set up another example of a user as an example in preparation for randomization. Over here, if the DFdiscover client is unavailable at the time, people will be able to go to the pharmacist and notify them that they are the next randomization user. So they can still get the treatment, and the pharmacist can ensure that, as long as they're confident that this is the next person to be randomized in the system, the pharmacist has the same list. They should be able to get the appropriate treatment. And then when the DFdiscover system is back online or power returns and you can finally get into the database, the users would go in and fill in this information, and this option right here, subject was randomized manually, can be checked, and you can input then your own chosen date. So if you know that it was randomized yesterday because today the power was out, you can input the time of when it was actually randomized, and then upon saving, it will randomize the subject to the next ID, which should match what the pharmacist provided, and this randomization date and time will remain locked in. So now that way you can ensure that even if the system is unavailable at the time, you can still get the appropriate treatment and the database gets the appropriate date and time available. I have sites that have unreliable internet connections. If the site must randomize offline, how flexible is the mechanism to bypass that assignment once we're back online? I believe that my previous example here covered that exact issue. So as long as the people who actually go to the pharmacist, if that order remains the same of how you enter them into the database, everything should line up appropriately. And as an admin, you can always go to the sequence tracker, so the admin sequencer plate, and adjust the numbers accordingly if you need to plug in people at the appropriate randomization number. But that is only in very rare cases, and I wouldn't imagine that to encounter, but there are ways to get around the edit checks, and we can look into that if you ever encounter that. But in most cases, you will talk to the pharmacist, they will provide the next available treatment, give them that number, and as long as once the system is back online, you go in and randomize in that same sequence, everything should flow appropriately. Is the unblinded randomization list in the system? No. So once the randomization lists are developed, the blinded version that has just the sequence IDs and the actual randomization values, those are plugged into the database. So over here, I have a lookup table called random250 for the randomization information for site 250. And it is just a list of values of the sequence number on the left and the randomization number on the right. I do not have any information about which drug is associated with which randomization number. That is only for the unblinded individuals of the study. And that might be just the pharmacist, it might be the sponsor, I don't know, it depends study per study. And there are methods of which people can be blinded in cases of emergency, but not by the database, and that will boil down to your study protocol. What is your process to forward the randomization value to the unblinded pharmacist? Once someone is randomized, you can set up an email to be sent out directly to the people of your choice. So you can have that number be sent directly to the pharmacist if you would like, so they can start preparing the treatment. Or once you randomize and your number is available, you can always print off that CRF and bring that to the pharmacist, whether it's through an email that gets automatically generated or whether it's through a physical piece of paper that you can bring or take a picture of or something to provide that confirmation. It, again, boils down to your study protocol. Are you able to show how the lookup table and how a randomization list is uploaded to the system? So it's really just a plain text file. So what we did in our case is we have a data analytics group, and to them, we just pointed them towards the protocol of the study, which had information about how large each permuted block should be and how many people inside of each block should be associated with each treatment option. From that, they generated just a list like this list over here, and we just copy pasted the numbers into the system by just plugging it in. That is how you implement a lookup table. And so you could create these, and it's no complex system there. What gets more complicated is when you want to actually tie in the edit check to know which lookup table to look for and to track it all, but that's what's covered in the in-depth training. Is there any way you can hide a center-like admin sequence from being viewed by everyone? I don't believe there's a way to hide the site because you need to make the site visible, but what you can do is right now when I open up this, it hides every single visit except for the admin sequencer. For the user, it would hide even this, so they wouldn't be able to find this record. So in the end, they're going to see a random participant in here, and if they try and open it, it won't show them anything. So it won't get in the way, but it is necessary so then the system can find the record and update the admin sequencer plate. This is a consequence of wanting to have things tracked together in the same site. You can re-engineer this edit check to, instead of having a sequencer plate that tracks all sites, all conditions, to maybe have a special participant ID that exists within each site. So we could have an administrative ID that exists within each clinic or within each center, and in that it will track the information for that exact site. But we found it most easy and most clean to have it all in one location that is off to the side. And even if people do try and open up the administrative thing, it would hide everything. Because I'm an administrator, it doesn't hide this last component, but for a general user, it would hide that last piece. Could the lookup table of the randomization be changed mid-study? For example, if the randomization allocation is changed due to enrollment. The lookup tables, although technically can be changed, I don't know what kind of ethical boundaries or protocol boundaries that crosses over to be changing something that fragile midstream, but I would imagine that if you had like 10 people enrolled and you go to the next permuted block, so if the randomization list is 21 here and this is blocks of 7 and you haven't reached the end of the second permuted block, the third block, maybe the fourth block, maybe those can be altered, but I would definitely look at the protocol. So once developed and launched, how easy / difficult / time consuming was it to add new sites to the randomization process? To add a new site, so once I have this established and adding a new site, it boils down to a few steps where I have to go into my DF setup here. I would add a new field that would be for site 550 or of any choice. We would need to get the sequence numbers and randomization numbers from your statistics team that can provide those. And then you would need to update the edit checks. So I will show just the top of the edit check here. We have a component here where we put in the condition, and it will then, from that, find which field to reference on the sequence randomizer and which table to use. So you would just add, in this case, like 4 lines of code and implement that new lookup table and add the field. Those 3 components in, everything should run immediately after. So it isn't very difficult if you have all the pieces. So what happens if the site accidentally randomizes? So if the site accidentally randomizes, it's a case much like if you accidentally handed out an envelope in the previous systems of randomization where that envelope is pretty much and technically burned. Although theoretically you could go into the admin sequencer plate and unrandomize, that is not advised, and it is something that would again boil down to your protocol on whether that is accepted. But in that case, if the person is randomized and they shouldn't have been, we have tried to implement a lot of stops to prevent that from occurring. But if someone still gets through and says they're eligible and then they randomize and then you find out that they're not actually randomized, then that is just a sadly wasted randomization value, and you will have to proceed with a potentially imbalanced system. The examples have been specific to blinded randomization. Is it possible to use this for unblinded randomization so that the treatment is recorded in the database? Yes. So the way the edit check is currently set up, it just extracts from that lookup table and has the sequence number on the left, randomization number on the right. We can add the third column if we're trying to conduct a unblinded study, if we're trying to conduct an unblinded study, we could add a third column that has the actual treatment option here and adjust the edit check slightly to grab two values from the lookup table, the randomization number and the treatment that is associated with that number can be extracted at the same time. So yes, it is possible using the system, but the code right now isn't necessarily constructed to achieve that as its primary goal. What level permissions is required to perform randomization on the randomization plate? This will boil down again to how you set up your study. The way we have it set up is that for plate 499, anyone who should have access to randomization capabilities has then data modify permissions to the admin sequencer plate at level 6. That way, then when the edit check goes through and it wants to update that plate and not pull the record down or move it to any other level, it remains where it is. So that will be adjusted in DFadmin as appropriate to wherever you are keeping your randomization plate. If it's living at level 6, that's the level that you need to give permissions. If it lives at a different level or at level 1, but at a very specific visit number, then that's what the permissions will have to be tailored to. Yes, you can restrict access to site by user role permissions. So yes, you can restrict access to which sites people see, but if you remove someone's permissions from being able to see the administrative site, the edit check will not be able to proceed and randomize the user. Sadly, if you remove permissions from that visit, then that means no edit checks can go into that location either. So by restricting someone's role or permissions to not have access and see the administrative site, it will then suddenly be also hidden from edit checks, and the edit check won't be able to find the sequence IDs that it needs.
Thomas, we have one other question. Is there a limit to the amount of sites you can have?
Technically, the limit is about how many fields you can put on to the admin sequencer plate, and even then you could always create additional plates. But yeah, you can track 10 sites, you can track 50 sites, you can track 20 sites, and within each site by gender per age group. As long as you can parse out the conditions inside of the edit check to say, if all these are true, then look at this table, you can track as many different lists as you want. Just know that with more lists, that means you're going to have to add more lookup tables, which needs more values calculated. That is just some work up front, but once it's up and running, it takes absolutely like no maintenance. Yeah, and then adding additional sites or additional conditions is just a matter of adding the table and updating the code and giving it a field to track that sequence ID. Does anyone else have any other questions?
There's another question. What is the best method for ensuring, if there are any issues, that the programmer yourself perhaps is contacted to help resolve them? Like, is there something that pops up that directs somebody?
Yes, so we have implemented that inside of the edit check itself, you can specify what kind of error message comes up depending on what the problem is. So if the lookup table was not appropriately configured, you can set up and explain like, okay, well, it failed to randomize, please contact DFnet data manager. That's what we have going on. Or if the permissions, there's some error that they cannot reach the admin sequencer plate, like their user permissions are not set up appropriately. Again, it's a different error message that pops up, and you can customize this to redirect to whomever you want. And when either of these emails, or whenever either of these errors pop up, these emails will be contacted to be notified about this information. So if you are at a site and something doesn't work, like the system's down or the lookup table, you've already randomized 21 people and the lookup table only has 21 values, and it reaches the end. What does it do? It's going to give you an error, and it's going to send an email directly to the person of your choice. So then if it's the programmer at your facility, they can take a look into the code or see what they can do to resolve the error, so they are notified as soon as possible. And you can also contact us at DFnet, and we would be able to assist with any configuration issues, or if something isn't working or not behaving the way that is expected, we can help debug and clean that. Does anyone else have any further questions?
Yeah. Hi, can you hear us?
Yes.
Okay.
On the admin sequence plate, your sequence number is drop-down list or is only a text field? Could you show it again? Yeah, this one, the 17.
Yes.
So any text only show one randomization value, right? The latest one?
So yes, this one tells you how many people have been randomized. So the last person that I just randomized got randomized to the value 036, which was the 7th sequence number in this lookup table, and that's why it's saying 17. That way, the next time the edit check runs, it knows that the next value it's going to assign is 033, and then it will update this form to instead say 18. But it knows then if at site 350 someone randomizes, it's not going to go to field or sequence ID 17, it's going to go and look at sequence ID 4. So it knows that the last person randomized at site 350 was randomized to the value 296. And then next time it will be randomized to 467. And you can always alter these from being numbers if you want them to be alphanumeric, if you want some actual drug ID or something established, you can change this to what you want. The important part is just on the left-hand side, there's a numerical value that establishes how many people have been randomized.
Okay, thank you. Another one is for the, you can manually randomize the subject, right? But
Correct.
if you enter the number, the randomization number, or it's created automatically?
So it's created automatically. So if you randomize manually outside of the DFdiscover system, so the power is out or internet connectivity is weak, and you get the treatment without the system, you just need to ensure that that person is the next person to randomize inside of this system again. So once it goes back online and you randomize and you provide the date and time when the actual randomization happens, it will auto-populate the randomization number. So you do not need to have, or it won't even let you type it in. To ensure that you are randomizing them in the appropriate order, it will be plugging in those numbers for you.
It must be the next one, right?
Yes, it has to be in the same order, because otherwise the system will not be able to know, how many people you randomized or in which order, or who should be next. Is this going to be a number that people have already been randomized to? So you need to ensure that if people do manually get randomized, they do have to be in the exact same order then entered into the database.
You can't change it, right? If something wrong, you can't change the number, the randomization value, right?
Yeah, it's hard-coded, but there are ways to, if it's an absolute emergency, there are ways to, for administrators to alter things, but I think that would be more of protocol deviations or burned envelopes. And so that would boil down to your own study of how they would deal with a situation where something was misrandomized.
If we were to perform manual randomization, we would basically have the unblinded pharmacist who has all the codes associated with the treatments. They would know what the next sequence is, and they would provide that next sequence of treatment, and that's how it is, right? So it's a manual effort. Just a manual it's a coordination activity, basically.
Correct. If it goes into manual randomization, you will have to coordinate with the pharmacist to ensure that they know who the next person on the list is. They will then be able to randomize, in a way, the participant to get the appropriate treatment, and then when the database is back online, As long as you enter them in that same sequence, everything will fall back into line.
Also, Ted, so do you have special functions to handle the get the sequence from lookup table, or we just use the regular DF lookup?
This is just a regular lookup table, so it's plain text. I copy pasted from a notepad file, and it's just plain text, so there's no magical way to import. And the edit check currently is designed, and again, once you have access to the code, you can alter it, but the edit check is set up that it, as long as there's a sequence number on the left-hand side and a randomization value on the right-hand side, that's all that's necessary. And even if you don't have a direct file, and I know the next numbers, you could type them in. Technically, I would not recommend that because that's asking for typos, but it is possible. It's just a plain text file. There's no other magical component to it.
And also, so in the randomization plate, so those do you actually introduce new functionalities, new function calls to pop up those messages, or are those messages purely just like use DF warning and everything, so you can do in a very flexible way?
So yeah, we use typically DF warning. So in this edit check here at the top, we have a bunch of variables that track all the different components that occur on the admin sequencer plate. We have things like over here, ref field. This is which field we're going to be referencing for the sequence ID. We have variables that track which table we're going to be looking at and what the emailing information is, where the plate lives, and then from that, the system controls and meshes itself. So you don't have to go and keep maintaining it. You don't have to keep adding things other than small snippets of code. If you have a new site, you add these 4 lines of code and that's it. You don't have to create a new function call. DF warning and all those other scripts are all inside of this system, but yes, it utilizes everything inside of DataFax. It does not use any external scripts. That's part of our primary goal here, is to not have it be something that needs to run any script outside of the software to achieve randomization. So yes, DF warnings, DF mail, and all the basic components to an edit check just intertwined in a very flexible manner.
I see. Because you mentioned about the minimum requirement is DFdiscover 5.0. So then I'm wondering, looks like everything here, like even we use the version 4, looks like it should be work.
So, okay, thank you. That clarification makes sense. So the biggest issue here is that DF trigger, which is the core component of this edit check that updates the admin sequencer plate, does not work cross-participant in previous versions of DataFax. You can do cross-plate on the same participant, but because you need to hop over to a completely different site, a different participant ID, a different subject ID, you need the functionality of the system. If you want to create a randomization unit that scans through every single participant that exists here for the information, rather than tracking a sequence ID, you can, but that's slow, and we've had issues where that drops internet connectivity during our initial tests of randomization. So we started using DF trigger, which looks at a different participant ID, which that doesn't really work in previous versions of DataFax without external scripts and all sorts of complicated.
Okay, I understand. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Okay, we have one more in the chat.
One more question in the chat. All right. If you needed to close enrollment down per sponsor request, how to handle? This would boil down to the protocol of the study, I believe. The randomization unit, it's just a system that tracks how many people have been randomized.
Sorry, it's to temporarily close down enrollment, so it's not permanent. So if there's a safety event, you know, sponsors do say pause all future randomizations, is there a way to temporarily halt randomization and then pick it back up? Because in your example where you see that, you have 4 sites, it's pausing enrollment, not just at a site, but all sites until we get the green light to open again. So is there a way to pause that from happening in this current example?
Are you saying that people will be enrolling without randomization, or just no enrollment?
No enrollments, but temporarily pausing it so that they can't accidentally enroll. So, there's a SAE. Someone dies at one site and they figure something out. So they have to kind of pause the study. So we want to make sure accidentally no one can go in and enroll. Is there a way to put a kind of a pause in place? Is that built in? Is there a way to do that?
Outside of the randomization, we could create another edit check that prevents people from even saving the enrollment plate if the study is on a temporary close. So we can have an edit check that just says, okay, from this day to this day, do not allow people to save off on the enrollment record. And if they can't save off, the randomization also halts.
Got it. Thank you very much.
You said you can change it to the server time from the device time by additional code. Could you send that code to us? Because we have the problem for the edit flags for the current, not the randomization.
Yeah, so I can send code if you want to send me a email. So
yeah, thank you.
Yes, we can send the code. It's just slight alterations. Using DFcreate, you can rip out the date of when the system, or when the record technically is hitting the system, and use that date to plug in. Thank you, everybody, for participating in this webinar. We will be providing real soon an invitation to the in-depth training if you are actually interested in plugging this into your studies and making this work in your DFdiscover studies. And if you have any further questions, feel free to contact me. And if you want further information, real soon we will be posting information with the documentation, the recording of this webinar, and all sorts of things on medusa.dfnetresearch.com. If you have any questions regarding IT, so Medusa Access, you can go to itsupport@dfnetresearch.com. And if you have any questions about the randomization unit itself, you can contact support@datafax.com or my email, tatis@dfnetresearch.com directly. So there you go. So if you have any questions, feel free to contact me and I will be able to provide some. Thank you, everybody.